As many of you know, I'm always trying to find the solid bottom in the muddy pond called theology. Where's the bottom? Is there anything solid down there? Or is it only that stinky blue mud that's hard to walk in? You have stinky blue mud up here in the south. We have stinky blue mud. That's the stuff that's really, really full of all kinds of good, fertile, dead things, right? Stinky blue mud. I think the absolute bottom line essence of humanism was best summed up by Frederick Douglass. Douglass had himself escaped enslavement. He worked tirelessly for the rights of African Americans all his life. When a group of African American ministers came to him after emancipation and asked him to pray publicly to thank God for freedom, Douglass refused. He said, quote, "I bow to no priests, either of faith or unfaith. I claim, as against all sorts of people, simply perfect freedom of thought." Simply perfect freedom of thought. That's humanism. Douglass didn't call himself a humanist, but he was a seeker and a doer and a free thinker. Simply perfect freedom of thought. No dogma either way. Ideally, anyway. In practice, here's a dogma, there's a dogma, everywhere's a dogma. People just make up dogmas, anything we think of. Hey, but you got to think of it this way. It's what we do. There's even a dogma about not having a dogma. And there's a whole lot of blue mud to step through. Now let's count the ways that perfect freedom of thought gets constrained and inhibited. Sure, social forces potentially constrain and inhibit everybody's perfect freedom of thought. Make a list: working too much, not sleeping enough, hopeless debt, family obligations, constant worry, malnutrition, poor health care. That realm of necessity that Karl Marx talked about, that I discussed a few weeks ago. The realm of necessity. But that's not everything. That's not all the things that stop us from our perfect freedom of thought. What about what you can even think in the first place? The numbers tell us that we in North America are educated and not according to our zip codes, which translates to mean educated according to race, gender, social class, and on and on. All those things get in the way of the perfect freedom of thought, don't they? And, of course, let's not forget how you constrain and inhibit your own perfect freedom of thought. We all do. We get in our own way. We tell ourselves, no, you're not good enough to do that. We tell ourselves to stop. We tell ourselves to cool our jets and sit back and watch rather than participate fully in this thing we call existence, this thing that we call life. We don't experience freedom of thought, and we don't savor life's gifts. No, it's not just you who does that. It's all of us. It's the human condition. We just forget to stop and live. But I think this: the quest for each of us every day, ideally, is that perfect freedom of thought. Perfect freedom of thought outside those background programs that are always running in our brains. Racism, white supremacy, not being good enough, not being successful enough, on and on and on. Background programs bringing us down. There are so many impediments to perfect freedom of thought. Freedom from stereotypes and cliches that the culture around us creates and makes us think. Truth is always hard. Meaning and finding it is always difficult. Frederick Douglass described achieving his freedom from enslavement this way, quote, "I prayed for 20 years but received no answer until I prayed with my legs." Now, that's humanism, isn't it? Get on with the work. Get into the fight. Join in human community to combat those human-created injustices. Douglas made a larger point, however, a point that can create the next chapter of humanism, I believe, if we let it. Douglas gave us a vision of that simple, perfect freedom of thought. And it is simple. It's not complex. You don't have to do either or in your life, and you don't have to find dogma anytime you think something. There is a middle way, and I think that's what humanism is, or can be, if we let it. So yeah, our theme for June is beauty, the practice of savoring life's gifts. How do we practice savoring life's gifts? And as I said earlier, the fact is many of us don't do that, and many of us can't do that, can't take the time to savor beauty or consider what a life of beauty, meaning, and purpose might even look like. We live in the realm of necessity rather than the other realm that Karl Marx talks about, the realm of freedom. Getting from one to the other is the challenge of each of our lives. Now, as many of you know, I've been writing poems for a very long time. For me, writing poetry has been a way to explore beauty and truth and practice that pausing to savor life's gifts. It's a method that I have used to free my mind and get into the present moment, into the now. For me, and I'm at the other end of my life at this point, I can say that the writing of poetry has been the biggest force in my life in terms of freeing my mind and, kind of keeping me sane. Poetry has, I can say, quite literally kept me alive. I'm not sure what got me even interested in poetry, frankly, why I started writing it in the first place. I didn't know anybody who was a poet, and that was many years before the term spoken word was invented. Maybe it was reading the King James Version of the Bible all the time. Yeah, that inspired Walt Whitman as well, the way the oral language was phrased in the King James Version of the Bible. I don't know why I got into it, but I started searching for the poets who might inspire me. And as many of you know, the American beat poet Allen Ginsberg became my first inspiration and later my mentor. In those days, of course, Ginsberg did not appear in the textbooks of poetry. Ginsberg inspired me partly because Ginsberg was all the way out there all the time. When you met Allen, you met all of Allen. He lived life in a true, full manner. Ginsberg taught me that writing is both a political and a spiritual practice. One element of that is using writing to slow down and get into the moment. In his later years, Ginsberg always put a date and a time on each poem that he wrote. His last poem, handwritten a week before he died, is dated 3/30/97 a.m. And it's titled, Things I'll Not Do, Nostalgia. He knew he was dying. He said, never go to Bulgaria, had a booklet and an invitation. Same Albania, invited last year privately by lottery scammers or recovering alcoholics, or enlightened poets who guard the antique land of Hades. For Ginsberg, writing poetry was a way of working on the mind. Reading Ginsberg's interviews and essays led me, as a young person, to the European poetry movement a generation before Ginsberg called l'art pour l'art in French, or in English, art for art's sake, or in Latin, ars gratis artis. It was a short-lived movement in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It was immortalized, I guess, mostly by the fact that roaring lion on Metro Golden Mirror logo, above the roaring lion's head is ars gratis artis, art for the sake of art, which doesn't really fit movies if you stop to think about it too well, at least not that studio. But anyway, now you don't have to be a Dr. Freud to figure out why art for art's sake would appeal to me when I was a young person. I was attempting to escape a reality in which Everything we did was for the sake of survival and the sake of cash. Everything we did was in the realm of necessity. And yet, here were these really cool writers that I could read about. Now, one of the lesser-known figures in the movement of art for art's sake became my favorite, the Oxford professor Walter Pater. Most people haven't heard of him these days. He argued that art is the ultimate religion, and artists and writers are the high priests of that ultimate religion. Pater had himself fallen in love with the aesthetic beauty of Canterbury Cathedral. He considered becoming an Anglican priest, but there were two problems with that. One, he slowly became an atheist, and the other was he was gay. So, what was a lover of poetry to do in about 1890 with these things? Well, he would become the high priest of art. You know, and when people argue, and I hear this all the time about humanism, how can you have awe and wonder if you don't believe in traditional religion? Well, that problem has been solved for about 300 years by various poets, artists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You make religion out of art. Pater saw the world from a completely naturalistic perspective, just like any humanist, and he described the experience. Here goes, quote, "This at least of flame-like our life has, that it is but the concurrence, renewed from moment to moment, of forces parting sooner or later on their ways." It's just a big swirl out there. Our interior lives, or what Pater calls the inward world of thought and feeling, is a continual whirlpool. It's still more rapid, the more flame, more eager and devouring all the time. In the face of this rushing reality, Pater insisted that the way to live is with both focus and abandon at the same time. Focus and abandon. Quote, "Some spend this interval life in listlessness, some in high passions, the wisest, at least among the children of this world, in art and in song." He goes on to say, "Only be sure it is passion, and it does yield you this fruit of a quickened, multiplied consciousness, of such wisdom, the poetic passion, the desire for beauty, the love of art for its own sake has most. For art comes to you proposing frankly to give nothing but the highest quality to your moments as they pass, and simply for the sake of those moments." End quote. There was my choice, wasn't it? I was young, and things were either or. Yeah, listlessness or high passions. I think I choose high passion, right? Yeah, I want to spend my life in art and song rather than farming. And that was my choice. You see how Pater's quickened, multiplied consciousness rhymes with Douglas's simply perfect freedom of thought. Quickened, multiplied consciousness. Simple freedom of thought. My favorite passage from Pater and my guide to what writing was to become to me goes this way. Quote, "To burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits. For after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped mind. And meantime, it is only the roughness of the eye that makes any two persons, any two things, any two situations seem alike. Only the roughness of the eye makes any two people, two situations seem alike. Our failure is to form habits, for after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world." End quote. This sort of life sounded to me a whole lot better than staring down a field and trying to get the plow lines straight. Now, yeah, I was missing the point about that. I even missed the fact that as I went through in my heteronormative way, Peter lived his life very constrained. He was always under the threat of being outed by students and fellow professors, and therefore, of course, fired and jailed. That's a little bit of constraining. So yes, Walter Pater fairly well sums up the formula of our monthly theme, beauty, the practice of savoring life's gifts. The Art for Art's Sake movement was the first shot in a war that rages on still in the face of relentless capitalism. How do we slow down and smell the roses when we're always being pushed by necessity? How do we live fully in compassion and abandon when so much about our society is about restrictions, limitations, carrots and sticks everywhere? And most importantly, how do we work for that perfect freedom for everybody? Because that is our purpose in life. Many artists and thinkers have wrestled with these contradictions. It's no accident that the Art for Art's Sake movement occurred at the crest of European colonialism and capitalism in the Western world. Art for Art's Sake was a strong critique of where the Western world had gone and what it had become. It's no accident that marginalized groups formed the core of the artists and the intellectuals in that movement. They saw, and it continues to be a valid point, that the best use of Western religion and philosophy is a method for attacking Western religion and philosophy. After all, the classic Western mistake has been to reduce things, not us, right, but to the level of usable objects. That goes for everything that capitalism touches, from water to animals to our fellow human beings. Things, not us, usable objects. Everything that can be made a stereotype is made into a stereotype, which means an it, and then that it can be misused, abused, and often killed. An artist's job in the face of this is to question the stereotypes by looking closely, with new eyes, savoring the beauty of the ignored. That becomes the most revolutionary act. The Art for Art's Sake movement comes out of the high water mark of industrial capitalism and colonialism, but its message is still one of the best anecdotes to the way we live right now. In a system that turns everything into a commodity, refuse to generalize anything. Refuse to generalize, refuse to stereotype. Stop, savor, experience beauty, find the freedom. That is revolutionary. Implicit in the Art for Art's Sake movement is that the contemplation of beauty, music, nature, poetry, creates an alternative moral and ethical framework to work from. Also implicit in it is that Christian morality is inadequate to the human condition. You don't have to spend a lot of time over at the Walker Art Center next door to realize that these sentiments are still out there. They're not explicitly stated anymore so much, but they are the baseline assumptions of many artists today. Art is disruption of the cliched and the status quo. Art is the great humanizing force. If you've been listening, you've realized that, of course, what I've been saying about Art for Art's Sake is also what I say about humanism. A bedrock principle, way down in the blue mud, is that no human being should ever be treated as a means to an end. No human being should ever be treated as a means to an end. Humanism's call is that we treat every human being as inherently worthy of respect. Each person is a free agent, and our work is to set everyone free. Many expand that net wider. Should animals be treated as means to an end, which is food? More and more people are thinking not. In several nations at this point, various natural resources are being legally declared persons with inherent rights. Take, for example, the Ganges River. It has personhood in Indian law. In this way, human beings are going back to the future, since indigenous peoples often assumed the personhood of animals and the earth until Western colonizers changed the rules, treating the earth, the animals, and the people as expendable resources. Savoring life's gifts is not easy. It takes work. Simply perfect freedom of thought is not easy. It takes work. Freeing our own minds of stereotypes and prejudices, making ourselves the art that we practice daily, freeing our society from the bonds of necessity, making the world safe for beauty. It's a big task. It can't be done in our lifetimes. Maybe it can never be done at all. But I believe that's the work we are called to do.